Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint a flower in acrylics. Now I had two main focuses for this project, and that was to show how to blend and layer acrylics. Now really we can't actually blend acrylics if we don't have the right layering process in there, so both of these things go hand in hand. Now when creating the outer focus backgrounds where you've got larger sections of paint, we do want to be making sure that that paint is kept wet for as long as possible and then dry it at the necessary stages. Now this is something that is far easier to see in the real-time version on Patreon. I've got a voiceover that I'm explaining while I'm painting, so every single decision is explained in the moment. But what you want to be doing here is really focusing on preventing that paint from tacking up. Now my preferred way of doing that is to use a fine mist spray bottle and apply a layer of water over the top of that acrylic paint, and therefore that ensures that it can't dry. Now allowing it to dry at the right time is important. So now here all of this first layer is completely dry, and then I'm going to come in with an additional layer of blue paint at the bottom, and then I wanted to blend that into my existing dry layer. Now in order to do this, it's much easier to spray the water onto the surface first and then apply the paint and then blend that into your background. You're therefore going to be able to get that nice transition, but you do have to make sure that that first layer is completely dry. Now on the real-time version on Patreon, I do focus on how important it is to dry each layer, and of course I mention when that should be done at each process. Now that becomes more noticeable when we started working on the flower, because here it was important to make sure that more of the layers had chances to dry because we're using more of a layering process than we did on the background. Now the background literally took 2 layers, but as I continue to work on the flower, you're going to see how the multiple layers are going to be building up here, and then I'm going to be eventually pulling in some more of those blending techniques. Now onto the centre of the flower, and I haven't added a huge amount of detail to this one section because this wasn't my aim for this painting. But what I did want to show here is how you can layer the paint to create that beautiful bright colour saturation. Now I like to use Liquitex Basics because they are naturally quite transparent and they work beautifully for glazing. Now I do have a video here on YouTube that shows how I use glazes through different paintings that I'm showing there, through use of adjusting your glazes depending on the effect that you're trying to create. So if that video is of interest, I'll link that in the description below. Now as you can see here, what I'm doing is I'm applying a layer of white paint first, depending on the effect that I'm going for. Here I'm just doing little dots to create that impression of the centre of the flower. I'm waiting for that layer to completely dry, that's really important, it must be dry. And then I'm going over the top with a transparent layer of paint to adjust that colour. I can then go back in, add another layer of the white, add more detail, wait for that to dry and repeat the glazing layer and adjust the colour as I go. Now this is a wonderful way of working with acrylics because we don't ever have to worry about mixing the exact colour at each layer that we're creating. We can adjust the colour of an acrylic painting right at the end if we needed to. And this is something that I really do focus on all of my real-time tutorials. The use of glazes is something that I do in every single project. It makes the painting process so much easier and more enjoyable. Now onto the petals, and what I wanted to do for this painting is show a range of different blending techniques to show that there are different ways to get to the same end. Now of course different blending techniques create slightly different effects, so what I'm doing here at the moment is doing wet on wet blending. So I'm applying some lighter paint and then I'm going back in with some darker paint before that first lighter layer has a chance to dry. So I'm not using my fine mist spray bottle here, I am just using the wet paint to blend each of my layers. Now because the acrylic paint will be drying faster because I'm not using my fine mist spray bottle, I want to be working on one petal at a time. But as you can see here, because I'm only focusing on my main lights and darks, I'm not focusing on detail here, that paint stays wet long enough for me to create this softness at this initial stage. What's really important is when you're trying to work with acrylics in this way, don't try to get everything done at the first layer. It is all about the layering process and building it up in stages. It's never going to look amazing on that very first layer, but it's all about trusting the process, keep going And when that painting's finished, by the time we've added more of these layers, it will look more established. Now, because I am working with this wet on wet blending technique here, it's already starting to have some softness to it. It's not ideal, but it is better than just blocking it in with one solid colour. Now, the wonderful thing with acrylics is you could actually do that. You could paint all of the petals in a standard colour and then go over the top and add your highlight, build it up from dark to light. But I did want to create a little bit of softness at this first layer if I could, because I like to get things more accurate to that reference photo for my base layer. I personally just feel that I'm able to follow that reference photo more closely if I have things mapped in with my lights and my darks. But if you do want to break it up into a little bit more of a simpler process, then you definitely could start off with one colour and then put in your highlights and your lighter layers as you go. Now onto this section, this is where you can see that I'm using a small makeup brush to blend or soften the edges of my paint. Now this top section of the flower was out of focus, so this is why I picked this photo for this project. I could show some blending techniques for the top portion of the flower and then show some detailed layering techniques for the bottom part of the flower. This here enabled me to show a range of techniques in the real-time version on Patreon. Now what I am doing here to make sure that I'm getting some softness on the edges of these petals, I am applying water at various stages where I am enabling then the background to be slightly wet around that petal so I can easily move and blend that into the background. If the background area is completely dry, you're not going to be able to push that paint and soften the edges like I am here. So you do need to have some water on the surface in that area around the petal or the fur, whatever it is that you're trying to blur or soften, and therefore that's going to make it much easier to get this out of focus effect. Now all that layer is completely dry. I can now start to work on my second layer. This is where I'm going to start to really refine more of my highlights. So what I'm going to be working with is a new blending technique. I'm going to be applying the paint and then I'm going to use another brush to blend or soften the edges. Working with acrylics this way, depending on whether or not we're choosing to add water to soften with a makeup brush or a blending brush, or using an additional paintbrush to soften the edges, we can create a wide variety of effects. Now the one thing that's important here is look at how I'm still allowing the base layer to show through at various stages. I'm not trying to completely cover the layer underneath, because if we were doing that, there's no point in working with our multiple layers and building them up gradually as I am here. But I do still want to be able to provide a softness and good contrast. Now contrast is something that I talk about in all videos here on YouTube and on Patreon, and that is all about the values. So we want to be making sure that we've got our nice dark shadows and we've got our lighter highlights. Now with acrylics, it's very versatile. We don't just have to work strictly from dark to light. You can see here that I'm coming back in now with some darker mixtures and putting in some shadows. Now in all of my videos where I'm showing how to paint fur, I speak about the importance of fur direction. This is really important to make sure that we're moving the brush in the right way. Now of course this flower has no fur, but the way that the highlights and shadows are curving and moving, this is all still following that brush technique that we would be using when painting fur and all the changes in fur direction. So I do want to be making sure that I'm always curving my brush strokes. You'll notice here that there are no straight lines at all, and that's going to help to build up that realistic shape of each of the petals. Now as I continue to build up my layers here, again the drying time in between is very important. If you start to apply your paint too quickly when you don't allow the layer underneath to dry, that will lift up and you're not going to be creating the depth, because each of your layers are going to just blend into each other and get lost. Now you'll see here that I do move around this painting quite a lot. A moment ago I was working on the lower petals and now I'm working back on the outer focus portions at the top. Now this is just my preference. I do like to move about the painting, so I'm waiting for one area to dry. Rather than waste that time, I'll start working on the area next to it. But what's important here is I'm still only focusing on one petal at a time. Now when I'm painting animals with fur, I will take 1 or 2 square inches. I won't ever block in one solid layer for the entire subject and then wait for that to dry and then do the whole layer, the next layer, and so on. I will actually break everything up into small manageable chunks. Now, of course, it's all down to each artist's preference, but I do find that I'm more motivated and I work more efficiently that way. If I start blocking in whole layers, I do find that I personally start to rush and that I miss out on really important layers, and therefore the painting, when finished, potentially may not have the right depth. So I do like to break it up into nice small sections. Now for flowers, that just means for me that I like painting one petal at a time, but it does come together quickly. I'm not trying to get one petal completely finished, it's not about that. I do want to get each petal to the same standard at each layer, but I'm not trying to work through it really quickly by blocking in each layer at a time. Now the wonderful thing about working with the techniques that I've mentioned here is you can keep on repeating that same process until you get to the point where you're happy with your version. So it doesn't matter whatever it is that you're painting, if you want to get more detail, just keep on layering. You want to ease off on your blending techniques because obviously with details you don't want them too soft, but you do still want to be working with the layering process. Each layer that you add will be adding more depth, but it is important to make sure that you don't overwork an area. So if you do feel like, do you know what, this is okay, this is where I want it to be, leave it like that and then move on to the next section. If you do decide actually that you do need to add a few more details, then you can do that at the end. But it's always important to be making sure that you're allowing the layers at each stage to still show through. Now as I start to work on the next lighter layer, you'll see that I've switched over to a liner brush. Now this enabled me to get those longer lines for my highlights, but again I'm being very selective with where I'm putting them. The way that the highlights are bouncing off the petals is going to be very unique to each petal, because the way that sometimes that light bounces off a petal next to it may actually create a highlight that's not there on the petal to the left or the right. So it is important to study that reference photo for each individual section that you're working on. So the last layer for this painting was just a glaze to really lighten a few of my darker values, and this helped to just build in a little bit more softness as well. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload 2 to 3 videos to YouTube every week, so if you'd like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you would like to paint along to the real-time version of this tutorial, then I'll link all of my Patreon in the description below. If you do have any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments because I'm more than happy to help if I can. I'm going to be uploading another video at the end of the week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.